Hey guys, tonight we step quietly into the streets of early 19th century Berlin, where the air still carries the faint echo of rebuilding after the Napoleonic Wars, and where if you listen closely, the ground beneath your feet might seem just a little warmer than it should be. You're not here for loud history or dramatic battles. You're here for something slower, quieter, something that may or may not have ever been meant to be noticed. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history. Some parts are interpretation, and some parts drift gently into what-if imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, because historians debate more than they agree sometimes, and tonight you're not solving anything, you're just following clues. You probably won't survive this. I mean, not in the sense that you'll suddenly become a 19th century Berlin resident with questionable access to central heating and even more questionable plumbing. But stay with me anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with your location and the local time where you are right now. It's always fascinating to see where these quiet late night journeys reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly through Berlin in the years just after 1815. The city feels like it's waking up from a long and exhausting dream. Most historians agree that the aftermath of the Napoleonic conflicts left Berlin strained, but determined its streets a mix of old medieval patterns and new ambitions. Buildings are being repaired, expanded, sometimes completely replaced. Brick by brick, the city reshapes itself. You pass workers hauling stone, timber and coal. Always coal, it's everywhere. The smell lingers in the air, soft but constant, like a reminder that warmth now depends on something dug from deep underground. What's broadly accepted is that coal becomes central to Berlin's growth during this period. Homes, workshops and public buildings rely on it more and more. But as you walk, something feels organized, not chaotic rebuilding, not random expansion. There's a rhythm to it. Streets align with new construction. Foundations are dug with surprising consistency. A careful reading might suggest that planning is happening at a level that isn't immediately visible from the surface. You pause near a partially excavated street. Workers have opened the ground to lay something, new pipes perhaps, or drainage channels. Archaeology suggests that early 19th century cities often expanded their underground systems during rebuilding phases. Sewers, water conduits, basic infrastructure. Nothing unusual there. And yet, as you look closer, the layout seems intentional in a different way. The spacing between these underground paths isn't random. It repeats. Not perfectly, but enough to catch your attention. It's possible that this is simply efficient engineering. Standardization saves time, saves money. That's the practical explanation. Still, you can't help but wonder. What if the story is pointing at something else? You continue walking, boots tapping softly against uneven stone. The city hums with quiet industry, no roaring machines yet, just human effort measured persistent. And beneath it, something else begins to form in your imagination. A grid, not visible, not marked on any public sign, but hinted at through repeated patterns in construction, through the placement of cellars and foundations, through the way heat seems to linger longer in certain areas, even in the cool evening air. Let me rephrase that more carefully. This isn't evidence of anything unusual. It's a feeling, a pattern you think you notice. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You pass a group of officials speaking in low tones. Documents are exchanged. Plans are rolled out, then quickly rolled back up again. The evidence we do have points to extensive urban planning during this period, especially as Berlin begins to modernize. Roads are widened. Systems are improved. But what those systems include, that's where things become less clear. Historians still argue whether early 19th century Berlin's infrastructure expansion was purely functional, or if it reflected broader ambitions about controlling the urban environment. Most would say it's the former. Cities needed better sanitation, better heating, better organization. That alone is enough explanation. And yet one interpretation is that when cities rebuild after crisis, they sometimes experiment. Quietly, subtly. Not everything is documented in a way that survives. You stop near a cellar entrance, half open. A faint warmth drifts upward. Not the sharp heat of a nearby fire, but something softer, more diffused. You crouch slightly, peering down into the dim space. Probably just stored coal, maybe a furnace. That's the reasonable answer. But the warmth feels even, spread out, as if it's coming from more than one source. A fringe idea proposes that some early urban systems may have been more interconnected than we assume, especially in cities experimenting with centralized heating concepts. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in certain discussions, usually at the edges of academic curiosity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises a quiet question. What if the rebuilding of Berlin wasn't just about restoring what was lost, but about quietly redesigning how the city itself functioned? You stand up again, brushing dust from your coat. The street continues lined with buildings in various stages of completion. Some are pristine, others still skeletal, their inner structures exposed like a cross-section of the city's ambitions. There's a strange comfort in it, the predictability of construction, the logic of rebuilding. And yet beneath that comfort there's a small persistent uncertainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And right now you're standing right at the edge of all three. A cart rolls past its wheels, creaking softly. You step aside, letting it pass. The driver nods briefly, uninterested in anything beyond his task. Life here is practical, focused. There's no sense that anyone is aware of anything unusual beneath their feet. Or if they are, they're not saying. You take a slow breath. The air is cool now, evening settling in. But again, just for a moment, you notice it, that faint warmth rising from the ground. Subtle enough to ignore, easy enough to explain. Still, you keep walking. Because whatever is being built here, whether it's simply a growing city or something slightly more intricate, it hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And you have the sense that this is only the beginning. You keep moving through the streets, and the rhythm of the city begins to settle into something more predictable. Morning comes with carts of coal, afternoon brings the steady tap of tools, and evening drapes everything in a faint haze that smells like smoke and damp stone. Most historians agree that by the 1820s, coal had become the backbone of urban life in Berlin, powering not just homes, but workshops, bakeries, and small industries that quietly stitched the city back together. You notice it immediately, the dependence. Every building seems to have some relationship with heat. Chimneys rise like thin dark fingers into the sky. Cellars are filled with fuel, and the ground itself in certain places seems to hold warmth longer than it should. What's broadly accepted is that early industrial cities often struggled with heating efficiency. Individual stoves burned coal, but much of that heat was lost. A more cautious explanation could be that Berlin's planners began experimenting nothing dramatic, just incremental improvements. Shared heating spaces, better insulation, maybe even rudimentary attempts at distributing warmth between connected structures. You pause near a row of tightly packed buildings. Their walls nearly touch, separated by narrow gaps that seem too deliberate to be accidental. A careful reading might suggest that this kind of spacing helps retain heat, reducing exposure to cold air. It's practical, sensible, and yet as you walk between them you feel it again, that soft, lingering warmth. Not strong, not obvious, just present. You glance down. The stones beneath your boots are dry, even though the air carries a hint of moisture. That's not unusual, you tell yourself. Good drainage, perhaps. Or simply the effect of nearby heat sources. Still, the pattern continues. At one corner, workers are lowering cylindrical sections into the ground. Pipes, maybe, or conduits of some kind. The evidence we do have points to expanding infrastructure, water systems, drainage, and early forms of urban planning that aim to make cities more livable. But these pieces, they're thicker than simple drainage pipes, and they're placed at regular intervals. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Regular might be your interpretation. You're noticing a pattern, but that doesn't mean it was designed for anything unusual. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You lean casually against a wall, watching as the workers secure another section. No one seems secretive. No one is hiding anything. This is just construction. Public, ordinary, almost boring if you look at it the right way. And yet one interpretation is that when something becomes ordinary enough, people stop questioning it. Historians still argue whether early urban heating innovations in cities like Berlin were purely localized, or if there were early, loosely coordinated systems that linked multiple buildings. Most lean toward the simpler answer, individual solutions gradually improving over time. But a fringe idea proposes that some cities may have experimented with shared underground heat distribution long before modern district heating became standard. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appears occasionally in discussions about early industrial ingenuity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the placement of these underground structures begins to feel slightly more intentional. You continue walking, turning onto a broader street where larger buildings dominate. Government offices, perhaps. Administrative centres. The kind of places where planning decisions are made recorded and sometimes simplified for public understanding. A popular rumour claims that certain infrastructure projects in early 19th century Europe were documented in ways that emphasised their basic functions while downplaying experimental aspects. This isn't something most historians would agree with outright. Still, it's an idea that lingers. You pass a building with an open lower level. Inside, you catch a glimpse of something unusual, not strange, exactly just organised. A network of brick channels runs along the floor, covered in places, exposed in others. They're too structured to be random. Probably ventilation, you think, or a way to direct heat from a central furnace. That's the logical explanation. But the channels extend beyond the room, disappearing into the walls, suggesting connections you can't fully see. What if the story is pointing at something else? You step back out into the street, the image lingering in your mind. Brick channels, underground pipes, consistent spacing between structures. None of it proves anything unusual. In fact, it all fits comfortably within known practices of the time. And yet when you put it together, it starts to resemble something larger. A grid. Not in the modern engineered sense, not perfectly mapped or evenly spaced, but a loose network, a pattern that repeats just enough to feel deliberate. You walk along the edge of a canal, its dark water reflecting the fading light. The air here is cooler, but even so you notice pockets where the chill seems less sharp. Areas where the temperature feels slightly moderated. It's possible that nearby buildings are simply releasing heat. That's the most straightforward explanation. Cities naturally create microclimates even without complex systems. Still, the effect feels consistent. You crouch near the canal wall, placing a hand against the stone. It's not cold, not exactly warm either, just steady. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You stand again, brushing your hands together. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings softly, marking the hour. Life continues. People move through their routines, unaware or unconcerned with anything beneath the surface. And maybe that's the point. A system, if it exists, doesn't need to be hidden if no one thinks to question it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Right now, you're still walking that line. You pass another construction site, smaller this time. A narrow trench runs along the street, partially filled, partially exposed. Inside, you see more of those cylindrical structures connected by shorter segments that angle toward nearby buildings. It's neat, efficient, almost modular. A more cautious explanation could be that standardized components made construction easier and faster. That's common in growing cities. Repetition isn't mysterious, it's practical. But if you allow yourself a moment of quiet curiosity, you might notice how those modules align not just with buildings, but with each other, creating intersections, junctions, connections. You exhale slowly, watching your breath fade into the cooling air. Night is settling in now, and with it comes a deeper stillness. The city doesn't stop, but it softens. Sounds become more distant, movements more measured. And beneath it all, you can't quite shake the feeling that something continues steady, quiet, and largely unnoticed. You keep walking not because you've found anything definite, but because the pattern, whatever it is, hasn't finished revealing itself. And maybe it never will. But for now, that's enough. You follow the streets as they narrow again, and gradually your attention shifts downward. Not just to where you're stepping, but to what lies beneath. The surface of Berlin is busy, layered, and alive, but below it, there's another world taking shape, quieter, more structured. And if you're paying attention, just a little more deliberate than you might expect. Most historians agree that early 19th century cities invested heavily in underground systems, drainage channels, rudimentary sewers, storage spaces, and utility corridors. Archaeology suggests that Berlin in particular expanded these systems as part of its rebuilding process. It makes sense. A growing city needs infrastructure you don't necessarily see. You pause at the edge of a street where the ground has been partially opened. Workers move steadily, their motions practiced and efficient. Wooden supports brace the sides of a trench, and inside brickwork forms a curved channel, smooth, carefully laid and clearly designed to last. What's broadly accepted is that such channels were used for drainage, rainwater waste runoff, practical concerns solved with practical engineering. But as you walk along the trench, you begin to notice something else. The curve of the channel is consistent. The spacing between access points repeats, and every so often smaller side passages branch off at measured intervals leading toward nearby buildings. A careful reading might suggest that this is simply good design. Standardized layouts make maintenance easier. That's true. That's logical. Still, when you look at it from above, tracing the lines in your mind, it starts to resemble something more organized than a collection of individual solutions. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It resembles a pattern, not necessarily a hidden system, not necessarily anything unusual, just a pattern. Historians still argue whether early urban layouts like this reflect centralized planning or the gradual alignment of many smaller projects over time. There's no full consensus. Some see intention, others see coincidence shaped by necessity. You move on following the line of the street until it intersects with another. Here, the ground feels slightly uneven, as if it has been disturbed more than once. You notice a metal grate set into the stone, its design simple but sturdy. Warm air drifts upward, barely noticeable unless you stop and pay attention. You do. It's faint, but it's there. A more cautious explanation could be that heat from nearby buildings escapes through these openings. Ventilation, perhaps. Or the natural movement of warm air rising from underground spaces. That's the explanation most people would accept without question. But when you begin to notice more of these grates placed at intervals that feel just a bit too consistent, you start to wonder if they're connected. You crouch beside one, resting your hand just above it. The warmth is steady, not pulsing, not fluctuating, just constant. A fringe idea proposes that some early underground systems may have been designed not only for drainage or storage, but also for managing airflow and temperature. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appears now and then, usually framed as an overextension of otherwise practical engineering. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, these grates begin to feel like more than simple vents. They feel like access points. You stand again, brushing off your coat. The street stretches ahead and you follow it, counting your steps without meaning to. 10, 20, 30, and there another grate, same design, same size, same faint warmth. Coincidence, you tell yourself. Probably. You pass beneath an archway entering a courtyard surrounded by tall buildings. The noise of the street fades, replaced by a softer, enclosed quiet. Here the ground is paved with older stones worn smooth by years of use. And in the center of the courtyard there's a circular opening, covered but clearly intentional. A maintenance access point, perhaps. Something meant to be opened when needed, then sealed again. You walk toward it, curiosity pulling you closer. The cover is heavy iron, reinforced with a simple handle. No markings, no labels. You don't open it, not because you can't, but because something about it feels undisturbed. The evidence we do have points to many such access points existing in early urban infrastructure. They're necessary, functional, nothing mysterious about them. And yet one interpretation is that when systems become complex enough, their full purpose isn't always obvious to those using them. You step back, letting your gaze drift across the courtyard. The buildings here are older, their foundations deeper. If there is a network beneath the city, this is the kind of place where it might converge, or at least pass through. A popular rumour claims that some underground layouts in European cities follow geometric patterns that aren't immediately visible from street level. This isn't something most scholars take seriously. Still, the idea lingers, especially when people begin mapping these systems in detail. What if the story is pointing at something else? You leave the courtyard, returning to the street. Night has settled more fully now, and the city glows faintly under scattered lantern light. Shadows stretch longer, softening the edges of everything. As you walk, you begin to imagine the city from below, not as a series of disconnected tunnels, but as a network. Channels intersecting, pathways aligning, heat moving perhaps through spaces designed to guide it. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the image stays with you. Historians still argue whether any early 19th century city achieved anything resembling a coordinated underground grid beyond basic utilities. Most would say no. The technology, the resources, the need, it all points towards simpler explanations. But if you allow for even a small margin of uncertainty, you begin to see how easily a system could exist without being fully recognized for what it is. You stop at another grate, this one partially obscured by shadow. Again, the same faint warmth rises to meet you. Consistent, predictable, almost designed. You straighten, exhaling slowly. The air is cooler now, but the ground continues to whisper something different. Not loudly, not clearly, just enough to make you notice. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And right now you're standing somewhere in between, tracing patterns that may or may not mean anything at all. You take another step forward, then another. Because whatever lies beneath this city, whether it's simply the result of careful planning or something slightly more intricate, it's beginning to feel less like scattered pieces, and more like a map you're slowly learning to read. You keep walking, and without quite realizing it, your attention shifts from patterns you can see to moments you can't fully explain. The streets of Berlin feel quieter now, the kind of quiet that comes not from silence, but from everything settling into place. Lamps glow softly, footsteps fade, and beneath it all, the sense of structure you've been tracing begins to gather into something more focused. You find yourself near a larger construction site, one that seems more official than the others. The fencing is sturdier, the workers more organized, and there's a subtle sense that whatever is happening here matters, at least to someone keeping records. Most historians agree that around the 1820s, Berlin undertook numerous civic improvements, including road expansions, drainage upgrades, and foundational work to support a growing population. The evidence we do have points to administrative planning becoming more centralized during this period, with projects documented in municipal records, even if not always in great detail. You pause near a stack of wooden crates, watching as a group of workers carefully lowers something into a deep shaft. It's not just a pipe this time. It's a junction wider, reinforced with multiple openings branching out at measured angles. A careful reading might suggest that this is simply part of a larger utility system connecting different channels, distributing flow where needed. That's the practical explanation, and it fits comfortably within what's known. But as you watch them align it precisely, deliberately, you get the sense that this isn't being improvised. It's being followed. A plan. Let me rephrase that more carefully. There's evidence of planning, yes. But whether that plan extended into something like a coordinated grid beyond basic infrastructure, that's a possibility, not a certainty. You step a little closer, careful not to draw attention. The workers secure the structure, then begin connecting smaller segments to its openings. Each one leads in a different direction, disappearing into pre-dug channels that extend beneath the surrounding streets. Connections. You've seen them before, smaller, less obvious. But here, they're undeniable. Multiple paths converging, then spreading outward again. Historians still argue whether early 19th century infrastructure projects like this were designed as integrated systems or simply evolved that way as new sections were added over time. There's no full consensus. Some scholars emphasize efficiency and expansion. Others consider the possibility of more cohesive planning. You straighten slightly, stepping back as the workers continue. There's nothing secretive about what they're doing, no attempt to hide it. And yet without context, it's difficult to understand the full picture. You turn walking along the edge of the site, following where one of the channels disappears beneath the street. A series of markings, small, almost overlooked, are etched into nearby stones. Not symbols exactly, more like reference points, measurements. What's broadly accepted is that such markings were used for alignment during construction. They help maintain consistency across larger projects, but when you follow them step by step, they lead you to another site. Smaller, quieter, but clearly connected. One interpretation is that these markings form part of a larger map, not on paper, but embedded into the city itself. That's an interpretation, not a confirmed system. Still you follow. The next site reveals another junction. Smaller than the first, but similar in design. Again, multiple channels branching outward. Again, precise alignment. You begin to picture it not as isolated pieces, but as nodes in something larger. A grid. Not perfectly symmetrical, not mathematically exact, but structured enough to suggest intention. A fringe idea proposes that in 1825, Berlin may have experimented with a coordinated underground heating network, something that distributed warmth across multiple buildings through interconnected channels. This theory isn't widely accepted, and documented evidence is limited. Most historians would attribute such structures to evolving utility systems rather than a single unified design. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, these junctions begin to feel like more than simple intersections. They feel like control points. You pause at the edge of another shaft, peering down. The depth is difficult to judge in the low light, but you can make out brickwork lining the walls, carefully constructed, reinforced at intervals. At the bottom, a faint glow, not bright, just enough to suggest activity. Probably a lantern or a furnace. That's the reasonable explanation. Still, the glow feels steady, even, not flickering the way a flame usually does. You step back, exhaling slowly. What if the story is pointing at something else? You continue walking the pattern, now harder to ignore. Junctions, channels, markings, each one subtle on its own, but together they begin to form a system. You pass a building where the lower level has been partially exposed. Inside, you catch another glimpse of those brick channels you noticed earlier, running along the floor, disappearing into the walls, aligning with structures beyond the room. Connections again. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply efficient design heat or airflow directed where needed, using the materials and knowledge available at the time. That alone would be impressive enough. But when those channels align with underground junctions, and those junctions align with street-level patterns, you start to wonder if efficiency is the whole story. Historians still argue whether any such coordinated system in Berlin during this period would have been technically feasible. The materials, the engineering knowledge, it all suggests limits. And yet innovation often happens at the edges of those limits. You slow your pace, letting your thoughts settle. Some parts are documented. The rebuilding, the infrastructure, the expansion. Some parts are interpretation, the patterns, the alignments, the possibility of coordination. And some parts are gentle imagination, the idea that beneath your feet something was designed not just to support the city, but to subtly shape how it feels. You stop once more, standing over a section of ground that looks no different from the rest. Stone, dust, faint traces of recent work. And yet you can't shake the sense that below this exact spot something connects. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly. You shift your weight, feeling the firmness of the ground beneath you. Stable, reliable, and possibly layered with more intention than anyone walking above it would ever think to question. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take one last look at the construction site behind you, then turn forward again. Because now that you've seen the junctions, you can't unsee them. And whatever this system is, whether it's simply a well-organized network of early utilities or something slightly more intricate, it's no longer hidden in plain sight. At least not to you. You move on, but now the city feels different. Not because anything has changed above ground, but because you've started to notice what might be happening below it. The streets of Berlin continue their steady rhythm, yet every step carries a quiet question: how much of this warmth, this balance, is simply coincidence? And how much might be guided? Most historians agree that by the early 19th century, the basic principles of heat distribution were already understood in a practical sense. Warm air rises, enclosed spaces retain heat. Materials like brick and stone can store warmth and release it slowly. What's broadly accepted is that builders used these ideas to make homes more comfortable, especially during colder months. You pass a row of buildings with thick walls and low windows, their interiors glowing faintly from within. Heat contained and steady, that's expected, that's normal. But then you notice something subtle. The street itself doesn't feel as cold as it should. It's not warm, not exactly, but the chill seems softened, as if the edge has been taken off the night air. You pause, letting yourself feel it more carefully. A light breeze moves past, and instead of cutting sharply, it feels moderated. A more cautious explanation could be that the density of buildings creates a microclimate. Cities often trap heat, especially when structures are close together. That alone could explain the difference. And yet, as you continue walking, the effect persists even in more open spaces. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It seems to persist. You're noticing a pattern, but patterns can be misleading. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You turn onto a wider street where the spacing between buildings increases. Normally, you'd expect the temperature to drop slightly here with more exposure to open air, but it doesn't, not in any obvious way. You glance down again, almost instinctively now. The ground feels firm, dry, and faintly warm beneath your boots. Not enough to stand out to someone rushing past, but enough to register if you're paying attention. One interpretation is that heat from underground structures could be diffusing upward, spreading across the surface in subtle ways. That's not an extraordinary idea. Even simple systems can produce noticeable effects over time. But when those effects seem consistent across different parts of the city, you begin to wonder if something is distributing that heat. You pass another metal grate similar to the ones you've seen before. Without thinking, you pause beside it. Again, that faint, steady warmth rises to meet you. Not strong, not fluctuating, just present. Historians still argue whether any early heating systems in cities like Berlin were capable of influencing outdoor temperatures in a meaningful way. Most would say no, the scale required would be too large, the technology too limited. And yet small changes don't require massive systems. Sometimes a network of modest elements can produce a broader effect when they work together. A fringe idea proposes that if an interconnected underground grid existed, even a simple one, it might have subtly influenced localized weather conditions, softening cold spots, reducing frost, or stabilizing air near the ground. This theory isn't widely accepted, and direct evidence is limited. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the city around you begins to feel slightly different. Not controlled, just guided. You continue walking, passing a small open square. There are fewer buildings here, more space for air to move freely, and yet the temperature still feels balanced, neither sharply cold nor noticeably warm. You stop in the center, turning slowly. The sensation is subtle, almost easy to dismiss, but it's consistent with what you felt elsewhere. What if the story is pointing at something else? You close your eyes for a moment, focusing on the air. It moves gently, without the biting edge you might expect at this hour. When you open your eyes again, nothing has changed. The same buildings, the same quiet streets, the same faint warmth. A popular rumor claims that certain old cities were designed not just for shelter, but for comfort on a larger scale, using architecture and underground systems together to shape the environment itself. This isn't a widely accepted idea, but it appears occasionally in discussions about historical urban design. Most historians would point out that such coordination would require a level of planning and technology that wasn't fully developed at the time. And that's a fair point. Still, innovation doesn't always wait for perfect conditions. You walk toward the edge of the square where a narrow street leads away into shadow. As you enter it, the air shifts slightly cooler, but only by a small degree. The change is noticeable, but not dramatic. You glance back over your shoulder, comparing the two spaces, difference but not extremes. Balance rather than contrast. You continue down the narrow street, and again you notice how the buildings seem to guide the airflow. Openings align, corners soften the movement of wind. It's possible that this is simply the result of architectural choices made for practical reasons. But when those choices align with what you've seen beneath the ground, they begin to feel connected. A more cautious explanation could be that surface design and underground systems evolve together, each influencing the other in small ways. That doesn't require anything extraordinary, just careful planning over time. Still, when you imagine those underground channels carrying warmth, intersecting at junctions spreading outward through the city, you can't help but see the possibility of something more coordinated. Historians still argue whether such coordination, if it existed, would have been intentional or simply the result of overlapping improvements. There's no full consensus. You stop once more, resting your hand against a stone wall. It holds a faint trace of warmth, as if it's been gently heated from within or below. You let your hand linger there for a moment, then you pull it away. Because whatever this is, whether it's just the quiet efficiency of early urban design or something slightly more intricate, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And right now, standing in this softly tempered night air, you're beginning to feel how all three can overlap, without ever fully revealing where one ends and the next begins. You take a slow breath, the air cool but not biting, and then you keep walking, because the city is not done showing you its patterns yet. You keep walking, and as the night deepens, the city begins to feel layered, not just in space but in time. The streets of Berlin carry traces of everything that has been built, rebuilt, and quietly covered over. What you've been noticing, the warmth, the patterns, the repeating structures, now meet something new. Absence. You turn onto a street where construction looks finished. Not ongoing, not evolving, done. The ground is smooth, the stones neatly set, and whatever lay beneath has been sealed away. No open trenches, no visible access points. Just a surface that gives nothing away. Most historians agree that as cities modernized older infrastructure was often replaced, upgraded, or simply buried beneath newer layers. It was efficient, it was practical, and over time it made earlier systems harder to trace. You slow your steps, scanning the ground. If there was ever a pattern here, it's no longer visible. A more cautious explanation could be that what you've been following, those channels, junctions and vents, belongs to a phase of construction that was later absorbed into the city's growth, covered but not necessarily removed. That's the simplest explanation. And yet, as you continue, you notice something subtle. Even where the visible signs disappear, the feeling doesn't. The air remains gently moderated. The ground still holds that faint, steady warmth. Let me rephrase that more carefully. You think it does. Perception can be influenced by expectation. Once you start looking for patterns, it's easy to keep seeing them. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Still, the consistency lingers. You pass a building that looks newer than the others, cleaner lines, more uniform stonework. A sign of progress, of modernization. What's broadly accepted is that Berlin continued to evolve rapidly throughout the 19th century, with infrastructure adapting to new needs and technologies. But modernization often comes with a trade-off. Older systems don't always get removed. Sometimes they're simply built over. You stop near a corner where the pavement dips ever so slightly, as if something beneath it has settled over time. It's barely noticeable, easy to ignore, easy. But when you stand still, you can feel it, the faintest suggestion of warmth rising through the stone. A popular rumor claims that in some cities, earlier underground networks were intentionally buried rather than dismantled, either because removing them was too costly or because they still served a quiet function. This isn't widely accepted as a general rule, but there are documented cases of layered infrastructure in many urban environments. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea of something still existing beneath the surface doesn't feel so far-fetched. You continue walking, and soon you reach an area where the architecture shifts again, larger buildings, wider streets, more open space. The city feels more organized here, more controlled. And yet the same subtle balance in the air remains. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of visible infrastructure always means the system itself is gone. In many cases, the answer is yes, systems are replaced, updated or abandoned entirely. But not always. You pass over what looks like an ordinary section of street. No grates, no markings, no signs of access. And still, you pause. There's that warmth again, faint, consistent, almost as if whatever lies beneath is still active. That's a possibility, not a certainty. You crouch slightly, placing your hand against the ground. The stone is cool at first touch, but not cold. It holds a subtle residual warmth that doesn't match the night air. A more cautious explanation could be that heat from nearby buildings is radiating outward, spreading through the ground over time. That's entirely plausible. Cities are complex thermal environments, but when that warmth appears in areas without obvious nearby sources, you start to wonder. A fringe idea proposes that if an interconnected system once existed, parts of it might have continued functioning even after being buried either intentionally or simply because no one fully understood how to dismantle it without disrupting the city above. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is limited. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea lingers. You stand again, brushing your hands together. The street is quiet now, almost empty. A single lantern flickers in the distance, casting long shadows that stretch across the stone. You walk toward it, your steps slow and deliberate, because now you're not just looking for what's there. You're noticing what's missing. The grates have disappeared, the open channels are gone, the junctions are no longer visible. But the pattern, it hasn't entirely faded. What if the story is pointing at something else? You reach the lantern and pause beneath it. The light is soft, steady, illuminating a small section of ground that looks no different from anywhere else. And yet standing here you feel it again, that quiet balance in the air, not warm, not cold, just controlled. You exhale slowly, watching your breath drift and fade. Historians still argue whether any early system in Berlin could have been designed with such subtle environmental effects in mind. Most would say no, the intention was likely practical, focused on heating buildings rather than shaping outdoor conditions. And that's the grounded explanation. But when you consider how the patterns you followed seem to persist even where the structures are no longer visible, you begin to question whether disappearance always means absence. Some parts are documented, the rebuilding, the infrastructure, the modernization. Some parts are interpretation, the patterns continuing beneath the surface, the possibility of buried systems. And some parts are gentle imagination. The idea that something designed long ago might still be quietly influencing the city even if no one notices. You step away from the lantern, continuing down the street. Because now the mystery isn't just in what you can see, it's in what you can still feel. even when there's nothing left to point to. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And as you walk, the city feels just a little deeper than it did before. You keep moving, and by now the city feels less like a place and more like a layered conversation. One voice above ground, another below, and somewhere in between a quiet space where interpretation lives. The streets of Berlin stretch out ahead, familiar in appearance but no longer simple in meaning. You pass a building with tall windows and a modest plaque, the kind that suggests administration records decisions made in careful handwriting. Most historians agree that Berlin in the early 19th century was becoming more organized in how it documented civic works. Plans were drafted, archived, sometimes revised. The evidence we do have points to a growing bureaucracy, one that tried, at least in theory, to keep track of the city's expanding systems. You imagine those documents for a moment: diagrams, notes, measurements, perhaps references to drainage, heating, ventilation. Straightforward. But then again, documentation doesn't always capture everything. A careful reading might suggest that records tend to simplify complex systems into manageable descriptions. That doesn't mean anything is being hidden, it just means not every detail survives in a way that's easy to interpret later. You slow your pace, letting your thoughts settle, because now the question isn't just what existed, it's how people understood it. Historians still argue whether the engineers and planners of this period saw their work as isolated improvements or as parts of a larger, interconnected vision. There's no full consensus. Some believe the systems evolved piece by piece. Others suggest there may have been broader planning intentions, even if they weren't fully realized. You turn onto a quieter street where the buildings feel older again, their foundations deep and steady. The air here carries that same subtle balance you've been noticing all along. You don't question it as much anymore. You've felt it too many times. A more cautious explanation could be that your perception has adapted, that what once stood out now feels normal. That's entirely possible. The human mind is good at smoothing patterns over time. Still, you can't ignore the consistency. You pause near a doorway, resting your hand against the stone. Again, that faint trace of warmth. Not strong enough to draw attention, just enough to exist. A popular rumor claims that some historical systems were so well integrated into daily life that people stopped noticing them entirely. This isn't a widely accepted idea in a technical sense, but it does reflect something true about human behavior. We adapt quickly to what surrounds us. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it raises an interesting thought. What if whatever this system was, if it existed at all, was never meant to be hidden? What if it was simply unnoticed? You continue walking, your steps quieter now, more deliberate. The city feels calmer, as if it's settling into a rhythm that doesn't require explanation. And yet somewhere in that calm the questions remain. A fringe idea proposes that early 19th century infrastructure in certain European cities may have included experimental designs that went beyond immediate necessity systems, that explored how environments could be subtly shaped rather than just supported. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence is limited. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we allow for the possibility even briefly, it suggests that the line between practicality and innovation might have been less rigid than we assume. You pass beneath another archway, entering a narrow passage where the sound of your footsteps echoes softly. The air here feels slightly warmer than the street behind you. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. You stop in the middle of the passage, listening. There's no sound from below, no movement, no indication of anything active. And yet the sensation remains. You exhale slowly. Historians still argue whether sensations like this, subtle environmental differences, can be reliably linked to historical infrastructure without direct evidence. Most would caution against drawing strong conclusions. And that's fair, because right now you're not proving anything. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You step forward again, leaving the passage behind. The street opens up slightly, and in the distance you can see the faint outline of newer construction evidence that the city continues to change layer by layer. You think back to everything you've noticed. The channels, the junctions, the grates, the warmth, and then the disappearance. Each piece on its own is simple, explainable, grounded in what's known. But together, they form a question. What if the story is pointing at something else? You stop once more, this time not to observe but to reflect. Some parts are documented. The rebuilding of Berlin, the expansion of infrastructure, the use of coal and basic heating principles. Some parts are interpretation, the patterns aligning, the possibility of coordination, the idea of a network that extends beyond individual buildings. And some parts are gentle imagination, The thought that beneath your feet something was designed not just to function, but to influence. Not dramatically, not obviously, just subtly. You look down at the ground one more time as if expecting it to reveal something. It doesn't. And maybe that's the point. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You take a slow breath, letting the cool night air settle around you. The city feels steady, grounded, real. And yet just beneath that surface, there's still a question. You begin to walk again not because you expect to find an answer, but because the act of following the pattern has become its own quiet purpose. And somewhere along the way you realize something. Even if this system never existed in the way you've imagined, the possibility of it has already changed how you see the city. And that in its own way is enough to keep you moving forward. You keep walking and the city no longer feels like something you're exploring, it feels like something you're slowly learning to listen to. The streets of Berlin stretch out beneath a quiet night sky, steady and familiar, yet layered with everything you've noticed along the way. Most historians agree that modern Berlin rests on centuries of rebuilding, expansion and adaptation. What's broadly accepted is that beneath the visible city lies a complex mix of older foundations, forgotten passages and evolving infrastructure, some mapped, some partially understood and some simply absorbed into what came later. You walk across a wide street, its surface smooth and uninterrupted. No grates, no markings, no visible signs of what might lie beneath. And yet after everything you've noticed, you don't expect to see anything anymore. A more cautious explanation could be that whatever systems once existed, if they existed as anything more than practical utilities, have long since been replaced or rendered inactive. Cities change, they move forward, old designs give way to new ones. That's the grounded view. Still, archaeology suggests that fragments of earlier infrastructure often remain buried below preserved, not because they were meant to last forever, but because removing them would have been too disruptive. Layers build over time, and sometimes the past simply stays where it is. You pause near a quiet corner where the air feels calm, balanced, almost familiar now. That subtle moderation you noticed earlier no longer stands out. It blends into the background as if it has always been there. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It feels like it has always been there to you. That's a possibility shaped by everything you've experienced tonight. Historians still argue whether any early system in Berlin could have influenced the environment beyond the buildings it served. Most would say that such effects, if they occurred at all, would have been minor and unintentional. And yet small things can persist. A popular rumor claims that certain old systems, even when no longer maintained, can leave behind subtle traces, residual effects that become part of the environment itself. This isn't widely accepted in a technical sense, but it reflects an idea people return to again and again, that the past doesn't always disappear completely. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the city around you begins to feel like more than just its present form. It feels layered. You continue walking your pace slower now, more relaxed. There's no urgency anymore. No need to search for patterns or confirm anything. Because whatever this was, whether it was simply efficient infrastructure or something slightly more intricate, it has already done what it needed to do. It made you notice. A fringe idea proposes that the so-called hidden heating grid of 1825 may have been part of a broader attempt to shape urban environments in subtle ways, blending practicality with experimentation. This theory isn't widely accepted and direct evidence remains limited. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but if we allow for the possibility even briefly, it suggests that the line between necessity and innovation might have been softer than we assume. You stop once more this time without looking down. You don't need to, because now the ground beneath your feet feels less like a mystery to solve and more like a quiet presence, something that may or may not hold meaning, but exists all the same. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden machine, not a buried secret waiting to be uncovered, but a way of seeing. One interpretation is that the true grid isn't something physical at all, but a pattern of decisions, how people built, adapted, and experimented as their city grew. That's a grounded way to understand it. And yet, there's still that faint sense of connection you've been following all along. You take a slow breath, letting the air settle in your lungs. It's cool, but not sharp. Gentle, even. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented. The rebuilding of Berlin, the expansion of infrastructure, the use of heat materials and design to shape the city. Some parts are interpretation, the patterns aligning, the possibility of coordination, the idea of something more connected beneath the surface. And some parts are gentle imagination, The thought that just maybe the city once experimented with something quietly ambitious, something that didn't need to be remembered to leave an impression. You begin to walk again, but more slowly now, because the journey isn't about reaching an answer. It's about letting the question settle. The streets stretch on calm and steady. The buildings stand quietly holding their history without needing to explain it. And beneath it all, whether it's simply layered stone or something more intricate, there's a sense of continuity, something that connects past and present, even if only in the way you perceive it. You exhale softly, your steps becoming lighter, your thoughts quieter. And as you continue through the sleeping city, everything begins to slow. The patterns fade, the questions soften, the need to understand gently drifts away. All that remains is the feeling of walking steady, unhurried, grounded. You don't look for warmth anymore, you just notice the air. You don't trace patterns anymore, you just follow the street. And gradually the city becomes simple again. Not because it has changed, but because you have. The night settles deeper now, wrapping around the streets like a soft layer of stillness. You walk without thinking, your steps slow and even, each one quieter than the last. The buildings no longer ask for your attention. The ground no longer invites questions. Everything simply is. The air brushes gently against your face, cool and calm, carrying no urgency with it. Whatever warmth you thought you felt before has blended into the background, becoming part of the quiet balance of the night. You breathe in and out. And for a moment, there is no need to separate what is documented from what is imagined. No need to trace patterns or follow clues. Just the steady rhythm of your steps, the soft echo of the city at rest, and the quiet understanding that not every mystery needs to be solved to be meaningful. You keep walking, but now it feels more like drifting. The streets guide you without effort, the city holds you without question. And somewhere beneath it all, whether it's stone memory or something you simply imagined, there is a sense of continuity that doesn't ask to be explained. It just remains. Your steps slow even further. Your breathing softens. And the night, calm and steady, carries you gently forward until even the idea of the journey begins to fade. Until there is only stillness and rest.